Hi everyone and welcome to my Heartseeker Rogue build guide for Season 4. A lot of people have been waiting for this. I've been blasting with this build for a few days now. I've tried it all and also pushed, for example, here into Pit 100 on Hardcore with this build. So it works really well and it's a very simple, very easy to play build once you understand a few basic core mechanics, and it's also quite easy to set up. You don't need much to get this build going and you can play this even from very low levels onwards. The reason why this build works is because Blizzard has changed the way that Victimize works in Season 4. It just got a massive buff, and also thanks to the tempering modifiers, allowing us to just scale the damage of our basic attacks quite a lot, and in this case Victimize explosions too. So this is a Victimize build, which is a novelty for rogues. It has never really been viable, but now it is. A good thing about this build is also that it just kind of does it all really well. You have these heat-seeking arrows that just automatically go and target enemies, for example. So it's very simple to play it. It has decent AoE clear. It's not like the best AoE build, but even Helltide, it works just fine. And it's very fast, and you can speed farm the pits. Like I can do like 2-3 minute runs in like tier 70 with this or so. And this is on hardcore with like a very tanky setup. You can go way faster if you play this as a glass cannon on softcore. And this build is suited more than anything in the game probably, or at least on a rogue, to be a glass cannon if that's what you like to play as well. So you can really squeeze out more extra power and scale this to the moon. So while in like massive AoE packs, you don't necessarily have the best clear of this, you have really good boss damage. You decimate those bosses, as you can see here, a Pit tier 100 boss. That thing has probably at least 1 billion life or something like that, if I had to guess. And you can actually watch it melt, especially in those stagger nuke phases. So it does have really good damage output. You can take down the tormented bosses with this. Anything you want really, and it just kind of works great. So let's walk through the setup a little bit here. I have the planner. This is the entire setup that you need. There's no uniques required, and as I mentioned, this kind of just works from the start. There's 3 important aspects that you want to get though in order to really scale this the best way possible from the start. So number 1 is a cursed touch. So this is not 100% required because there are other ways to make enemies vulnerable, but this is probably the best way to make enemies vulnerable. And you need vulnerable on the target for this build to function because of Victimize. So Victimize gives you those explosions based on lucky hits and the damage done to the target. And the good thing about Heartseeker is it has very high lucky hit chance. It has 50% baseline. So a 1 in 4 arrows triggers Victimize explosions. And then you can scale lucky hit chance on your gear. And it's more like a 1 in 3 or so, maybe even 1 in 2 if you go really ham on lucky hit chance. So you get constantly all these explosions, and you also get 2 hits at the same time from Heartseeker because you have this second arrow with the ricochet that does 75% of the original. So that helps you out a little bit with, first of all, just more lucky hit triggers of, CC effects, Umber stacks, and also just more damage and more consistent Victimize explosions. So this is a really good package here. And you need to have a cursed touch in order to make enemies vulnerable. There's a second way to do this in the late game, which is the chance to make enemies vulnerable roll on the ring, or you can also put it on glove or amulet. However, I tried it and 1 roll doesn't seem enough. You need probably at least 2 to make this viable. And at that point, you can just as well go for cursed touch, and you always have vulnerable there. So there's nothing really you need to worry about basically. So that's really nice and comfy. And the other 2 aspects are the Moonrise aspect. You have this on the bow. This is just a massive damage multiplier, also gives you attack speed, also gives you movement speed. So this works with basic attacks and it's just cracked. So you want to have this with a high roll on the 2-handed weapon. And we have adaptability. This goes on the neck. This is a resource aspect. So it also buffs your basic attack damage by quite a lot. And while it's not strictly required, I think this is just such an important multiplier that you want to have this before you start out. All of the other damage modifiers that we have here are not really all that crazy. We have an inner calm here, so sometimes you can stand still, get a bigger bonus. We have an elements here, so this has like these swirly things around you, but you don't really play around it. It's just like an extra damage buff here and there. Same with Edge Masters, just like a damage buff, and Rapid for more attack speed. So those are the offensive aspects here. Defensively, I have Might, damage reduction. We have Umbrus, so this gives you the Dark Shroud stacks whenever you shoot. This goes automatically, so you invest into Dark Shroud. Very good defense for rogues. And we have Assimilation here. So you can Fortify. Fortify is 15% damage reduction. You can get a bit of dodge, and then you have this effect. It's kind of nice, but this is somewhat optional. You can do something else there. Now there are two other important ingredients to make the setup really work well. Number one is vulnerable damage on your gear. So you can roll vulnerable damage. You see this here on the bow, for example. We have vulnerable. You have this on the weapons. You can have this on the rings even, and then you have the gloves. But I think generally there's better choices there. But you can also temper vulnerable. So this was a kind of a surprise in the live patch when we didn't have that on the PTR. You can now temper vulnerable damage. It's a cutthroat finesse recipe, I think. So you want to try to put that everywhere you can. And like this, you get ridiculous amounts of vulnerable damage. You see here in the planner, in the sheet, it has like 1500%, giving you like 1240 extra like additive vulnerable damage. And that scales this victimized passive here. You see the damage increase is 1800% because it gives you 120% of your vulnerable damage value. And those explosions do 440% of the original. So this is where most of that damage comes from. On top of this, that seems like a bug. There is some double dipping going on with the victimized passive. There are a few effects that apply twice in the damage calculation for some reason. So most importantly, we have the exploit passive here. This one gives you basically lots of extra damage against either high health or low health targets. So especially when you're one-shotting stuff, this is really powerful. And it kind of like applies twice because first you deal more damage with the arrow, and then the victimized explosion deals more damage to a high health target as well, as long as the target is still high health after the arrow, I guess. So that is kind of important here, and that applies pretty much at all times. There are some other effects as well that double dip here that are kind of important to know about. One is the caltrops. So the main reason that we run caltrops is also because of the damage buff here. And this also goes up the more the targets are staying in the caltrops, and then it applies twice, similar to what I just explained with the exploit. First the arrow, then the victimized explosion, scaling again off that bigger arrow. So that is pretty powerful. And there's also some stuff in the paragons. We have the deadly ambush modifier here, the extra crit damage, so you want to have a bit of crit chance as well. And then there's also the two glyphs, chip, that gives you the stacking physical damage done, and pride, that gives you extra physical damage against high health and low health targets. So especially when you just one-shot enemies, this is a very powerful build because of this exploit scaling, because of the pride glyph and so on. Or also when you, for example, stagger a boss in like a real long boss fight towards the end of it, when the boss is like 30% life, you're gonna watch it just explode basically because you have all your multipliers, the caltrops up, you can get frigid finesse and so on a staggered boss. You can do ridiculous amounts of damage thanks to those modifiers. Now it seems somewhat likely that at some point this double dipping will be changed and it will no longer double dip. In the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really make that much of a difference, I would say. There are these kind of burst phases where you will feel it, but for like general gameplay, if they ever change that, it will not really affect the build too much, I would say. It will be felt a bit more on the higher end when you have really good gear, because for example, later on you want to have those exploit ranks on the passive. So right now this has a lot of value, and if that ever gets changed with the double dipping, then this will be reduced in value a little bit, and you're going to notice it more on the higher end. Same with, for example, the caltrops. We want to have caltrop size, caltrops duration. So especially on boss fights, you put those caltrops down, and early on when your gear is not really optimized, you will not get that much value from caltrops anyway, so you will not be so affected by any change in the double dipping. If you count it all together with all the effects active at the same time, in particular the caltrops being like the biggest one here, then the build does roughly triple or so of the regular damage. And if that is ever going to be changed, then you have to keep that in mind. The damage will go down a little bit. However, outside of using caltrops and deadly ambush, the double dips don't do all that much, and it would be more of a reduction of maybe a third or so for like typical scenarios where you just shoot into packs, for example, because the only real big modifier that applies here is the exploit. Now for the rest of the gear, one important modifier you want to have on your bow as well is the chance for Heartseeker to cast twice. You can get this to over 100%, so you always get 2 arrows. You can't stack more than 100%, so that's the cap. You want to try to hit that and then leave it there basically. So don't go too ham on this with masterworking or something like that. But the double arrows help a lot with just more hits, more damage, more procs and so on. And here, as I mentioned, caltrops duration and caltrops size. You want to have one of each. Caltrops duration actually extends the maximum buff of enhanced caltrops, which is really strong. And the size just helps to kind of keep bosses, for example, or sometimes even elite packs in there. Especially for higher pit tiers, for tormented bosses and these kind of things, you use the caltrops. You don't really have to use them very often outside of that, but for the high end, this is a really powerful tool. And the rest of the gear is just a good mix of dexterity, attack speed, crit chance, and lucky hit. Lucky hit is actually a direct damage multiplier to this build because Victimize is based on Lucky Hit. So we're going to try to invest into Lucky Hit where you can. You have it on a glove, for example. You can have it on the helm here. You can even put it on the rings if you like. So there are some options here. You can get a lot of Lucky Hit here. For example, the setup has 60% in this planner right now. So this makes the Victimize explosions just happen more often, giving you more DPS, because this is where all the damage comes from. And then you're going to try to stack a bit of defenses. We have life here on a bunch of pieces, movement speed, dodge, the resistances, of course. And like this, you are going to be fine. Now, one thing that people ask me a lot about is the Flurry. Why is Flurry in this setup? And the main reason for that is the attack speed bonus. So combo points Flurry gives you a 45% attack speed bonus with 3 combo points for 3 seconds. And you don't even have to hit any target with this. So basically all you do is you just shoot 1, 2, 3, use a Flurry, and then you just keep shooting for a few seconds, and then you use another Flurry again, and you keep shooting. So this effectively gives you more DPS. It's a bit clunky, but once you get the hang of it, you just use it as like a buff, basically. So you just like consider it as like another like cooldown that you press every few seconds to get a damage buff. You don't have to do this. It's not crucial for the success. If you really don't like using the Flurry every few seconds, another option is to just go inner sight. Even though you don't care about the resources, you can get a bit of a crit buff here sometimes, especially in like lower end speedruns and stuff. That is fine. But for the higher end, if you want to squeeze out the most damage, you do the Flurry stuff. And if you replace Flurry, I guess the next best skill I would put into the setup here is probably either Concealment, which I'm actually running for hardcore purposes, for the unstoppable mostly, or the Smoke Grenade. Smoke Grenade is pretty powerful as well, because you can actually get a damage buff there, you can get the daze, and if you really want, you could even put Explosive Worth aspect together with this, so they can activate your trap modifiers from range. So you can just throw a Smoke Grenade into a pack, and then you could, for example, get the Ambush Glyph and the Deadly Ambush Paragon node here. So this is pretty powerful. Another thing here is the Poison Trap. Why do we have that? Well, we have the caltrops already to apply all of our trap modifiers, but the Poison Trap is much more consistent in doing that. Bosses sometimes tend to move out of the caltrops and you have to put them there again, and then you lose some of your damage buffs. Also, we can have the debilitating toxins modifier here for 50% damage reduction. So I really like using that, especially on hardcore, but in general for like high-end pits, it's just really nice to have this extra damage reduction. So you can throw down the caltrops, you can throw down the Poison Trap, and you have like a large like cluster of like, you know, slows and knockdowns and all these like damage effects that you apply when enemies start coming after you as you kite away from them, for example, in the pit. So it's really nice. And as long as the poison dot is ticking on a target, it will be considered affected by poison for this, and it will be affected by traps for example, Deadly Ambush. So you get all of your damage modifiers there as well. But again, it's a kind of like optional choice. You don't have to go for this. If you want to go for Concealment as well, or if you want to go for Smoke Grenade here, or if you want to do something else, maybe even a Death Trap. So there are some options here, but you need at least one of the traps to activate Deadly Ambush and some of those modifiers, and that should usually be caltrops. But I like to run both instead. Now, some people are also wondering, why do you run a bow instead of a crossbow? Because crossbow has vulnerable damage. Well, there are some reasons for this. So number one is the crossbow vulnerable damage value is just kind of low compared to what you get from the gear already. You get like 1,000 something percent or so, and this 30% extra doesn't do that much. The bow has the same DPS, but it shoots faster, which means that you just get more consistent Victimize procs, and you get more consistent like all of these lucky hit effects. For example, here we have slow, we have freeze, we have daze, we have freeze again, we have stun. So this gives you more stagger, it gives you more crowd control, it gives you more umber stacks, so just more of everything basically. It just feels kind of good, and using a bow is just more stylish, to be honest. And on top of this, we have the Weapon Mastery passive. So this one gives you also extra damage against the vulnerable enemies, 12% instead of 50% crit damage with crossbows. And we don't have enough crit chance to make this crossbow effect better than the bow effect. I mean, not even getting close, you need like 80% crit chance for that to even break even. And since you always want to have enemies be vulnerable, we just go with the bow effect here as well. Lastly, let's go over the Paragon here. I already showed a few things, but the setup is fairly straightforward. In particular, when you're leveling up, there will be a few of those missing modifiers, like for example the ambush that I mentioned a few times now, but you basically can just kind of follow this progression here and build up your Paragon boards if you're still leveling a rogue. Otherwise, just make the setup here. It has 6 boards. We have a few of those legendary nodes, Exploit Weakness. We have the Deadly Ambush and the Cheap Shot there. And then we have also 6 glyphs. So there's control here, extra damage against frozen. We freeze from our lucky hit chances there. We have ranger, gives us damage reduction with the bow. We have pride for extra physical damage and also the rare notes here for the all res. We have diminish to get extra damage reduction and also the life buff here. We have exploit to make enemies vulnerable the first time we hit them. This is really powerful. If you're still leveling up, you might want to try to put this on like an earlier board just to have them more consistent and vulnerable. But later on you want to have it here and max it out for the extra vuln damage. And then we have chip for extra physical damage. So this is here, pretty straightforward setup. And we have a lot of defenses here that has, you know, damage reduction there. We have life everywhere and damage reduction from other effects. So that's basically how the entire setup is built. And in total, this planner comes down to like 55k life. We have like over 50% dodge and armor cap, res cap. So it's overall a pretty solid tanky setup. You can play it safely at range. And as I mentioned, if you want, you can even go way more glass cannon. You don't need that much life. You can go for more damage and kind of squeeze out more DPS if you really want. So feel free to adjust this depending on how much you like to get one shot or not. One thing to note here about the resistances is that this setup doesn't actually have any resistances on gear. So you might want to be careful, especially in the early levels. You want to cap your resistances at all times. And you may have to roll a res or two or like an all res roll or something somewhere in order to make this work. This is like a fully optimized setup where you can actually cap your resistances mostly from the paragons and then the gems here. Because, for example, we buff the tolerance node here with pride. So it gives us a lot of extra all res here. We have a bunch of all res there. And then you need like the right combo of the rings here. Like you have a cold and poison here, for example, in order to hit those 70 everywhere. But depending on what kind of rings you got, for example, you might not be able to cap your resistances otherwise without taking more nodes or without having maybe one all-res roll or so. So keep that in mind. And that also concludes this build guide here. So hope you have a lot of fun with it. I am having a blast with the Rogue in Season 4 so far. I have more stuff coming. I'm working on a bunch of builds and build guides. And of course the mystical Shadow Step Rogue that I want to try very soon. So stay tuned for that one. I'm quite excited to see how this will go. And that being said, there's also the Heartseeker Rogue Guide that we have here on Maxroll. This is written by Dioxide, who actually originally made this planner and gave us the build idea to actually write it for the page. And here we go. I mostly took his planner and then started optimizing it for my own liking and started tweaking the paragons and so on. But overall, this is the same setup. So if you'd like to have the written guide, then go check this one out. And you can also go ask Dioxide a lot of questions about it. He has been playing this a ton as well, as far as I know. So hope you like this video, and I'll see you guys next time.